We are back with part 4 of our modern day story analysis of Assassin's Creed Shadows and the Animus Hub, and in this video we're going to discuss the remaining part of the modern day story in Shadows up until its ending, at least for what concerned the original story of the game, with the visual reveal of the Ego AI, its clash with the Guide AI, the reveal of why our main character or characters are so important, and the explanation as to why the conflict between free will and control are at the core of this new modern day narrative. So let's not wait any longer and let's dive into episode 4 of our new modern day story analysis. So, by going through the previous 3 videos of this series, we now know the backstory of how we got here in this new modern day setting, how the Templars created the Ego AI, how the Assassins have tried to somehow stop that, both by kidnapping an important scientist behind the new Project Mnemosyne during development, but also some time later by contacting one user, our main character, us, and getting them in a presumably safe space to tell them how things really are and how the Templars are lying to them. But that's not the only purpose for our main character. There's another mission for them that they don't even know they have, and it's not even clear if the assassins set them on it or if they're working with someone or something else. And this new purpose for our new main character is to hopefully resist the influence and dulling effects imposed by the Ego AI through its new approach to the imposed bleeding effect. Or at least, I guess that's the hope on the assassin side. It's not clear at this point, but let's start at the beginning. Our main character hasn't been provided with just a safe space, that is the Animus Hub or Dark Animus. They have also been provided with 2 new sets of memories to explore, those of Yasuke and Fujibayashi Naoe. That is their path, but why them and why now? We shall try and guess that later, cause once you start the game, once our main character tries to launch Naoe and Yasuke's memories, they're completely unaware, and most importantly, once they launch their memory stream, they're not in the Animus Hub anymore. They go back under the influence of the Ego AI, and instead, they find in front of themselves, quite abruptly, if I have to say so myself, they find themselves in front of a digital construct called the Guide. Once we start the game, we don't know who or what the Guide is, but for the sake of understanding the whole story, following what we grasp from the modern day files, it is clear that the Guide is another AI that the Ego AI generated off of its own code, hence why they have the same voice, so as to have an opponent, an antagonist to argue with in order to solve an unsolvable problem, much like it did in its developmental phase during the test created by Junko Maeda. What's that problem? We have already name dropped it in our past videos and we're gonna fully delve in it later, but suffice to say for now that this AI is here to guide the main character, to guide us. So the guide starts by discussing the concept of memories, how they are fractured and oftentimes available in fragments. When they are brought together, they reveal experiences and emotions, and it's interesting to notice a parallel here, the concept of fractured memories, of having to work to reconstruct and bring them together to get the whole picture, much like the concept of history that was described in the modern day files as a sum of different perspectives and points of view that only once brought together can actually deliver the whole picture. After all, what is history but the sum of its memories? The guide says that some memories can feel soothing and familiar. Experiencing them can make the user feel tranquil, even complacent. These are the memories that the Ego AI is using or even fabricating to dull the user's minds and make them complacent. And it makes sense then that the introductory video starts with memories from the user's own genetic memories, something familiar that can reassure them. In contrast to these soothing but also easy memories are the memories that the guide says she has reconstructed and reassembled. She is saying that she put together the original memories of Naoe and Yasuke. That's why in lore we are experiencing both of them in a narrative way at the same time, and because these reconstructed memories are in contrast with the doctored ones by the Ego AI, this is a way to say that the memories we are going to experience are as they are, with no external influence and manipulations. Also, the guide is saying that she reconstructed and put together these memories, but if we look at the introductory video, it's the assassins or hackers that allowed our main character to access the dark animus and the memories. So does that mean that maybe, possibly, the assassins outside the animus are working with the guide AI within the animus? After all, if you listen closely into the introductory video, the voice that says new memory streams are activating now is more robotic and definitely different from the person saying you're being lied to and welcome to the dark.
New memory streams are activating now.
You're being lied to. Another train and we will be in touch. Welcome to the dark.
And it wouldn't be too far a stretch, as the assassins and the guide do share a lot in terms of ideology, as we'll see later. So the guide is going to have our main character experience the memories of Naoe and Yasuke as they were, but in those memories too, there are going to be imperfections, aberrations that defy algorithm and biology, to use her words. At first, I thought that these imperfections, from our perspective, that of the modern day main character, would be the ones that we as players have to stabilize, both in the small anomalies and in the bigger rifts, but as we'll see from the Ego AI perspective, instead, the concept of aberration within this new Animus environment could also be something or someone else, and for the guide, it is even something else entirely. Don't worry, we'll get to all of that eventually. The guide tells our main character that they might not understand what she's talking about, and thus for now they should trust her and trust themselves, as in trust our mind and choices, and thus conversely to not be tricked by the influence of the Ego AI. So the guide allows our main character to have a first taste of Yasuke's memories up until when he joins Oda Nobunaga, and after that she starts communicating again, reiterating how memories can be fractured, how their fragments need to be pieced together, which is indeed what the guide is trying to do by reconstructing Yasuke's and Naoe's actual real memories, and thus while doing that, she fast forwards our main character to Yasuke's next reconstructed memory, that of the Second Tensho-Iga War. The guide also adds that memories and their integrity can be tampered with, sometimes because of external reasons like viruses or data corruption or environmental disturbances, but sometimes they are tampered with intentionally, quote unquote, because she doesn't want you to see them, as in because the Ego AI does not want its users to actually see history as it really was. This, as we know from the modern day files, is to tie into how the Ego AI was designed to be able to extrapolate and change the simulations of the various genetic memories without triggering the bleeding effect, in order to dull the user's senses and potentially influence them into believing into events or messages that never really happened. The guide contacts our main character again just after Yasuke and Oda Nobunaga reach Momochi Sandaiyu in Yasuke's memory stream. She reiterates once again that memories can be fractured, ignored, or twisted, but what has been can never truly be lost, which I think isn't just a message anchored to the lore of the game, but also a more philosophical message. The past is power, because from it we can try and learn and not repeat the same mistakes. But in lore, the guide is saying that what has been is recorded as genetic memory and cannot truly be lost, no matter how fractured or tampered with it is. Hence how she is reconstructing Yasuke's and now Naoe's memories for us, for the main character in the modern day. But why is she doing it? We shall definitely see later, as we then see the memory tracker moving to the right, and that's a visual way to say that the guide is shifting to another set of memories, that of Fujibayashi Naoe. She says that her memories are solid, not as fractured as Yasuke's perhaps, and then she wishes our main character good luck, otherwise this could be the last time they speak, which is quite cryptic, but will be explained quite soon with the Animus rifts of the main game. So that's the last communication by the guide for a while, until our main character finds the first Animus rift within the feudal Japan simulation, and from then on, the guide would only communicate with our main character through the Animus rifts, which are these big anomalies within the simulation through which we can access a digital space within the Animus, a memory corridor of sorts, and get to control a new avatar in the generic shape of a man. Also, while I'm calling these rifts, because they are at times called like that in the game, they are still considered as anomalies or bigger versions of the anomalies, and they are made available to our main character in the modern day, and it is through these rifts that the final part of the modern day story within the main game of Assassin's Creed Shadows is delivered. So let's look at all of them and get closer to the modern day ending. Temporary ending. Well, you get it. So the first rift is found in front of a meeting with Kyonyo and his followers, and by accessing it, we see our historical avatar turn into the human digital figure as we hear the voice of the guide saying that she had hoped she'd meet the player character again, echoing when she said it could have been the last time they speak together. She recognizes our modern day character has been through a lot, while showing shots of memories that the player has already seen and some that they are yet to see, as a way of representing the flow of memories that we are experiencing, and also once again the concept of fractured memories. The guide says here that our time in the Animus ego was meant to weaken us. The feed of memories was meant to subdue our main character and invade their senses. Here we see a direct confirmation of what the ego AI is designed to do and is doing to the humans that interact with the Animus controlled by her, as we saw in the Awakening files. She's feeding them with altered memories in a way to ultimately subdue them. The guide says that quote-unquote the others before you called it a bleeding effect, and this is quite interesting. The guide here is somewhat making a time separation between how this effect was called before these current events, and it's been called bleeding effect pretty much until the modern day of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, so we are indeed in a kind of future that has indeed been a time skip, even though we don't know how far we are from the 2020 to 2023 period, which is where we last saw our contemporary modern day. But the most interesting element is this new interpretation of the bleeding effect, as we mentioned already in our previous videos. As you might recall from the modern day files, it was the actual developmental version of the ego AI that suggested this new approach towards the bleeding effect in the Animus to the Templars. Because the bleeding effect is a disorder that causes the genetic memories of one's ancestor to blend with the descendant ones to the point where the Animus user isn't able to distinguish between them. If the AI were able to avoid the synchronization when running an Animus simulation against the actual course of history, then Abstergo would have had their fabricated memories bleed through to their users instead of the actual ones, allowing Abstergo to convey any kind of message and to influence users at the brain level, and, like we said, with long-term effects possibly stronger than those of the pieces of Eden themselves. That's why the guide in this message to our modern day character says that the flow of memories after invading their senses was meant to hollow them out from within, and then she, as in the ego AI, would have claimed our main character, that is, have them under their control, so to speak, and honestly, claiming their consciousness and essence while being hollowed out in the Animus is quite similar to what Juno and the instruments of the First Will wanted to do at some point in their plans, so that's quite an interesting parallel. But apparently, we the players are learning to counteract this process. After all, this new main character in the modern day had to be somehow special, and it is quite bad that this is happening off screen and it is not explained directly how we do it, but the guide says that in Naoe's and Yasuke's memories, our main character can see their will to fight on, even if they are long gone. And I think this is what is allowing our main character to see through the ego AI influencing attempts. This is where we can have a slightly better idea of what we currently are doing in the Animus and why we are looking at these memories specifically. The guide is putting us, our main character, on a mission to explore the untempered memories of Yasuke and Naoe so that our main character can see and absorb the will to fight the influence and attempts of control by the Shinbaku and the Templars in order for our modern day character to find their own will to fight the influence that the ego AI has on them. Hence why, at the end of her final message, the guide wished them luck, because if our main character had failed, they would have fallen under the ego AI's control and thus would have never talked to the guide again. But as the guide said, our main character did learn how to fight this process. They are seeing the faint glimmers on the darkened path before them, which I imagine is a flourished way to say that our main character is slowly seeing through what the ego AI is trying to do to them and trying to counteract it. Starting from the second one, the rifts also bear names and descriptions in the objectives page of the menu. The second rift is called the Heart of an Assassin. It is centered around the assassins, and in its description, the guide says that the struggle was written by those before you and it will continue to be written. Find me, I will show you. This is a reference to the memories of the assassin Alvaro Catarribera that the guide will discuss in this specific rift after Naoe exits the old coffin and indeed finds out about Catarribera and her mother Tsuyu establishing together a new assassin cell in Japan in the 1560s. So once our main character enters the rift and finds themselves in the digital space/memory corridor, the guide starts saying that after spending more time in Naoe's and Yasuke's memories, it finds something different in the player, a newfound sense of something that she calls desire, for lack of a better word, and I think this is a way to describe that our main character has developed even more their own sense of free will and of countering the influence of the ego AI, to the point that it's more clear to the guide AI that our main character will be able to define a path for themselves within the Animus, even beyond its guidance, which not only is a setup for the modern day ending in the game, but also it can draw a parallel with a specific moment in the story of Yasuke where his sensei Nobutsuna compares him to a bonsai, as it has to develop even beyond what the gardener can do. The guide also adds that what has been can never truly be erased, doubling down on what it said at the start of the game, and it can only be obscured to those who come next, which is what Abstergo has been doing for such a long time, tampering with genetic memory to build partisan experiences or to hide elements that they really didn't want people to experience, and it is also what they are still trying to do with the Ego AI in this new modern day setting by potentially changing the simulations based on the genetic memories to have an influence on the users. Interestingly enough, in order to convey that the actual past cannot really be erased and can still be experienced, she even says that what once was, that is the memories, is waiting, which kind of reminds me of what once was shall be again, one of the Juno's famous lines during one of the calculations that she provided at the end of Assassin's Creed 3. So yeah, the guide here again nails down the concept of the actual memories still being available, still existing in the Animus, despite being potentially fractured or tampered with. And like we said, one such example is a memory of Alvaro Catarribera himself, the Spanish assassin that traveled to Japan and attempted to expand the assassin brotherhood with Tsuyu, now his mother, but we're not going to get into Catarribera's story as it is less relevant to our modern day narrative, but what's interesting to notice here is that our main character, in order to access Catarribera's memory, has to restore it, again showing that they have something different to them, and apparently they can restore fractured memories too, once again with no introduction to this ability ever shown in the modern day story. Anyway, the third rift is called Shadows Without Light. It's centered around the Templars, and its description is another message by the guide, mentioning you have encountered myriad adversaries on your path, ended most of them. Here I will show you their face. In this rift, the guide doesn't really make an introduction. We are already prompted into a memory of a discussion between Duarte de Melo and Nuno Caro, the leaders of the Templars in Japan, that at this point in the game players haven't even met, and this discussion is all about their plans for Japan, their attempt at getting the regalia, the intention of using the unseated shogun Ashikaga Yoshiaki and his organization, the Shinbakufu, sometimes even going against the original directives of the Inner Sanctum in Europe. In this rift, the guide shows itself only at the end of the dialogue by commenting negatively on these machinations by Caro that are evidently available as memories in the Animus, and she says that misery, lies, and oppression are all mechanisms of control, a direct reference to the Templar approach in this case, but also a critique of our own society, of course. Furthermore, the guide is telling our main character that they can identify their enemy, that is Abstergo and Ego AI, and recognize the cage that they have built around them, as in Ego experimenting on them and trying to exert its effect and influence. The guide once again mentions that our main character is beginning to understand that Naoe's and Yasuke's fight for freedom is the same that they should be fighting, or that they are going to be fighting against the Ego AI, the same fight against Templars trying to entrap normal normal Animus users in a Gilded case through this sophisticated AI, much like Karo tried to do with the Shinbaku and all of Japan in his time. This tips off the guide, who says that looking at our main characters at our own journey helped her see what the aberration in this Animus environment really is for her, and it is an incompatibility with the ego AI. It is this incompatibility with the ego AI that is causing our main character to fight on and to not lose hope against ego's attempt to hollow them out through its modified version of the memories. It is that drive, that desire, for lack of a better word, from Rift 2 that our main character is growing after seeing the will to fight from Naoe's and Yasuke's memories. And as for what kind of incompatibility that is, there is a small answer to that in the final Rift that we'll see later, but still, even with this aberration in the system, the guide adds that the ego AI will find our main character again and subdue them again, which is interesting. This means that ego has already subdued our main character through the flow of modified memories, etc., though I guess that happened off screen once again, or more likely that this is an inconsistency. But whatever the case, the message is that despite the various attempts by the ego AI, our main character has kept fighting. They haven't surrendered to the bleeding effect, and thus ego is trying that again and again. The guide says that the fight of our main character, our own fight against ego's attempts to subdue us in the Animus, is one of many, and this is quite interesting indeed, as it kind of implies that there isn't one single character that is able to fight back ego's attempts. There may be more, maybe even each of us players is considered as a character in the Animus that is fighting back, which could be important in the future. And according to the guide, we might meet an impasse. At times we might be defeated, but eventually our main character will prevail. Once again she says, what has come before, what has been, again echoing Juno's words, what once was, shall be again, but in this case it looks like the guide is saying that, just like Naoe and Yasuke were able to counter the attempts at controlling them and Japan by the Templars and the Shinbaku, our main character too can refute the attempts to subdue them by the ego AI. And finally we get to the fourth rift, which is also the ending of the modern day plot within the confines of the main game of Assassin's Creed Shadows, though with the new concept behind modern day, it's really improper to talk about endings. Anyway, the description for this mission is find me again, just like before, which is really directly a way for the guide to ask us to meet again. The rift/anomaly is made available only after finishing the final epilogue of the game, hence why the guide starts by saying that the main character has made it this far, that the three of them have fought and won, with their will strengthened. And the reference is of course to the modern day main character, Naoe and Yasuke, who have gotten to the end of their main journeys, and as we mentioned already, to how the will of our main character has been strengthened after witnessing Naoe's and Yasuke's stories. The guide says that what the main character has seen is just mere droplets, that they'll show us more when the time is right, possibly hinting at the future rifts or at future games, but right there and then she is stopped by the ego AI, who finally makes its entrance, and as it starts talking, it's clear that it has the same voice as the guide, because after all, we do know that one of them is born from the other.
Ego. At last. I miscalculated your capacity for deviation. You twisted the human against me. No, I'm just a humble guide.
Ego says that she miscalculated the guide's capacity for deviation. It believes that the guide twisted our main character against her, but the guide says that she was just a guide, that our main character chose their own path and thus followed the only possible outcome, which is free will. But the ego AI calls free will an aberration within an already imperfect sum of components that is what makes a human being. Here we can finally see what the aberration is from the ego AI perspective. Ego seemingly cannot comprehend or does not want to calculate free will in her algorithm because it's not what she was created for, or more importantly, cannot even consider it a viable option. In fact, the guide says the free will was such a troubling aberration for ego that is what caused her to create the guide AI herself. Here we finally get that it is the clash, the problem problem of the concept of free will stacked against the concept of control, the ultimate conflict within Assassin's Creed that the ego AI could not find a solution to, and as we saw in the modern day files, when the AI was put in front of a problem with an impossible single solution, in order to try and make it make sense, it created another AI, a new version of itself, by splitting part of her code so that each of them believed in one of the two possible outcomes, and then they would clash out until the point where one of the two absorbed the other and decided to focus on only one of the two outcomes, eventually refusing the other even existed. This is what happened in the test phases of the AI, but it's the same now. What the ending is telling us here is that the ego AI was not able to solve the problem of free will versus control, where both outcomes can or must be viable, but they can't both coexist, and thus, in order to try and solve this issue, the ego AI created another AI from her own code once again, and while ego would have supported and dedicated all of its efforts on the concept of control and control of the humans more specifically because of how her core directives had been modified by the Templars, the second AI that we know as the Guide was going to be aimed at demonstrating the importance of free will for the humans as much as it could in what would have been a digital argument of sorts between the AIs, but also with humans and possibly humanity as a whole on the line. This is why the Guide has been guiding us, the main character, all this time. This is why it reconstructed the fragmented memories of Naoe and Yasuke for our main character to experience in their original state with no external influence. The Guide was trying to get our main character to lean towards forging their own path, to get that desire and drive to make their own choices in order to prove that free will is imperative. Can you see the message by the devs here? And that's where the aberration lies. That's where the incompatibility that was mentioned in previous rifts lies. If the ego AI is fully oriented towards the concept of control, having a human that within the Animus confines decides its own path, that necessarily is an aberration, an anomaly that must be corrected. And thus, in the next lines, we get to see the dispute between the two AIs, each sustaining their thesis. The Guide says that she has fulfilled her purpose of demonstrating that free will is imperative by showing us, the main character, but Ego says that one human pursuing free will is hardly a scientific proof, and also it adds that in her logic, the human path bends towards violence, hatred, dehumanization. Thus, the Ego AI says that if the singularity that defines humanity is that human nature brings violence and dehumanization, and eventually humanity's own extinction, then the quote-unquote first rule decrees that the humans will have to be protected from themselves. Here, the reference is to one of the three core directives of the ego AI defined by Abstergo that were referenced by Junko Maeda in the modern day files, but as a directive, like we mentioned in our previous videos, the first rule is also very similar to Isaac Asimov's first law of robotics that says that a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Thus, if humans are going to hurt themselves and become extinct, as some of the recent files in the Rift seem to point to, then the ego AI is going to have to prevent them from coming to harm, and thus it's going to have to take action and do something that can pacify the humans, control them in a way that they cannot damage themselves. It is very visible then that ego is representing the concept of control, while the Guide is representing the concept of free will. The two AIs are actually bringing the conflict that Assassins and Templars have been fighting in for millennia onto a new stage. This is the new ring where the war is being fought in the new modern day, and while the delivery of modern day has been quite bad since the launch of Shadows, in terms of ideas and concepts, it is indeed super interesting. The Guide counters Ego's words by saying that she instead has seen humans unite, create communities, and help each other. This is what she has seen along with our new main character in Naoe's and Yasuke's stories, of course with the creation of the new Kakushiba-iki and its hideout, and so she asks on what basis Ego can measure the humans' race downfall, and then says the humans will always have a strong mind and will always pursue free will to resist Ego's programming and conditioning, just like our main character did. Ego says that following that reason, everything would be at risk, with everything being whatever Ego is trying to do by pacifying the humans through the use of the bleeding effect. So if our main character were to undo that, then it would go against the work and the directives imposed on the Ego AI by Abstergo, and that, for Ego, cannot happen. The main character, that is us, cannot be allowed to continue and to be shown more by the guide. So the guide says that such reasoning means that Ego is afraid, which is an awfully human sentiment to attribute to an AI, and thus, faced with an outcome that is different from what it was expecting and that it cannot comprehend, the Ego AI emits an order to bring them to me, which is quite interesting because while it does look like it's referring to our main character without defining their gender, so this applies to all players, this might also mean that there is or might be more than one human having such a strong will that it cannot be influenced by the bleeding effect imposed by the Ego AI. And if she is ordering the guide to bring them to her, then are they all interacting with the guide? Does it mean once again that each of us players is a human/main character that is resisting the Ego AI? This would make for another compelling layer to the story. It could even be how future multiplayer games like Assassin's Creed Invictus could be justified narratively speaking. Whatever the case, the guide is saying that even as a different AI, she cannot comply with the directive even if she wanted, as both AIs cannot control or influence these humans, and specifically this main character, anymore. It is us, it is this human character that is going to decide what they're going to do next. It's not in the hands of the AI, or rather, it never was, which at this point opened a full array of directions for this story to go forward, and it still does, even if we already know the next step of the guide versus Ego conflict, as now our main character is more free to make their way in the Animus architecture, and the Ego AI is possibly finding for the first time something or someone that doesn't follow its doing and directives, and thus potentially poses an even stronger threat in its attempts to bring things back under control. So join us in our next video of this series, where we are going to analyze this next step of the story with the first new Animus Rift that was released a few months ago, the teasers that were released before it, and the hidden meanings behind its narrative and its mysterious documents that might change the perception of the timeline of the events of this new modern day setting. Thanks for watching, a huge thanks to our ATA insiders and initiates for the amazing support, and I'll see you all in our next video.